Welcome back. So we're here today to talk about the MP curve, summarizing how the real interest rate is determined. MP stands for monetary policy. So, monetary policy, the process of setting interest rates in an effort to influence economic conditions. It's one of the two policy choices that federal policymakers have. There's fiscal policy, where they can change government spending and taxes, or they can change interest rates. And these both are aimed at stabilizing the economy when it falls off track, mostly during recessions, and it's trying to get people to spend more. So you can either affect their spending through changing their tax rate or spending more in the economy, fiscal policy, or in monetary policy, it's affecting the interest rate, which makes it cheaper. If you're lowering the interest rate, it makes it cheaper for you to borrow to spend. So, monetary policy. In the U.S., the Federal Reserve executes our monetary policy. The Federal Reserve is our central bank. Every modern economy has a central bank in charge of this for their country. In England, it's the Bank of England. Every country has a central bank. Our central bank is called the Federal Reserve. A little bit confusing because the federal government is not the same as the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve does monetary policy. They're non-elected. And the federal government is elected, obviously, and they do fiscal policy. So we'll start with the risk-free interest rate. So imagine that there is a risk-free loan out there, 100% sure that it's going to get paid back. There's still a cost though, right? Because there's still an opportunity cost of using somebody else's money, or if you're the lender, of being without your money for a while. So you do charge somebody for the use of that money. So interest rate is the rate paid for borrowing someone's money, or if you're the lender, the rate that you get paid. So if there is a risk-free loan, then you have this risk-free rate. The Federal Reserve has this rate, sets this rate. The federal funds rate is the rate that it's called. It's effectively a risk-free rate. It's a short-term interest rate. It's got a confusing, sort of boring name, but all it is the rate that banks charge each other for overnight loans. Banks often need to do this because they are short on reserves. They didn't make their 10% required reserve ratio. Banks are required to hold back money, sort of in the vault, so to speak, for when people come and need to withdraw their funds. So the Fed sets that reserve ratio. Banks need to sometimes borrow to make sure they have enough for that, so they borrow from each other, because other banks inevitably will have too many reserves. They'll have way over the 10%. But that's the technical part behind the federal funds rate. At this point, you can just think of the federal funds rate as a very short-term, a very low-risk interest rate that all banks pay or are paid. So in a sense, it's the very bottom of all the short-term rates in the economy. And other rates are built on the federal funds rate, and then add risk or whatever the other things that increase the interest rate. So we'll add the risk premium to that risk-free rate. So let's assume instead of a risk-free loan, you're loaning money to me, and you have a less than 100% feeling that I'm going to pay you back. And of course, the less you know somebody, the more that's going to be true, right? So, in fact, lenders do this all the time without knowing all the ins and outs of, the probability that you'll pay them back. They kind of sort of estimate, right, the probability of your risk by your demographics, your gender, your age, whatever. You get profiled, basically. So you have a risk premium, whatever that is. And sometimes in the economy, there's a higher risk premium as everything is getting riskier. Maybe there's a COVID-19 pandemic, for instance. You're going to get a lot more feeling of risk out there. We don't know if people are going to be defaulting on their loans, and so people charge more for others to borrow their money. So the real interest rate is just the risk-free plus the risk premium. The MP curve is just that. We're done, right? The MP curve illustrates the current real interest rate, which is those two things, monetary policy, which sets the federal funds rate, that risk-free rate, and then the risk premium. Add those together. It looks like this. The interest rate on the vertical axis is the real interest rate, right? And on the horizontal axis, the output gap. So we're seeking the relationship between the real interest rate and the output gap. Now, when it comes to monetary policy, or the MP curve, it's just two things. It's the risk-free interest rate, which in this case, let's assume it's 3.5%. And so the risk premium must be 0.5%, right? To add up to a total of 4%. And if there's a change in the risk premium or in the risk-free interest rate, your MP curve will shift up or down. So let's try it on for size. Let's assume the risk-free interest rate is currently 3.5%, inflation is 1%, and the risk premium is 1.5%. What's the real interest rate? Hint, there's a piece of superfluous information in here that you do not need. Go ahead and answer. The answer, C, 5%. How so? 3.5% for the risk-free, and the risk premium is 1.5%. You don't need the inflation rate to solve this problem. All right, so to review, the federal funds rate is set by the Fed, and it's effectively a risk-free interest rate. The MP curve illustrates the real interest rate, and the real interest rate reflects those two chunks, the risk-free interest rate and the risk premium. That's it for now. You're down with the MP curve?